My sister stole my passport before my scholarship interview, but I had a secret backup plan. That morning, the light through the kitchen window hit the marble countertop in a way that almost felt staged, like the calm before something breaks. I remember the smell of Zoe's expensive vanilla candle burning in the corner, the sound of Mom humming as she stirred her tea, and the way everyone paused when I walked in. Nothing had been said yet, but something had already shifted. I didn't know it then, but I was hours away from watching my carefully built future slip through someone else's hands. My name is Haley Baldwin. I'm 24, a software engineer specializing in healthcare data systems, born and raised in Portland, Oregon, for most of my life. I tried to keep things quiet, manageable, professional. I wasn't the loud one in the family, not the Instagram star, not the darling daughter who quoted scripture and cried on command. That was Zoe's role, and she played it flawlessly. 3 years younger than me and worshipped like she walked on water. Zoe had this way of turning every room into her stage. Even Sunday dinners weren't safe from her curated humility and conveniently timed tears. Meanwhile, I worked my way through college with a double major, published 3 research papers before I was 23, and built an AI tool that flagged early signs of chronic illness in underserved populations. No one at home asked me about it. The only time my name came up in family conversation was when someone needed to contrast me against Zoe's calling. They said I was too logical, too serious, not open to God's path. I used to think maybe they were right, until 2 months ago, when I received an invitation to interview for a prestigious health tech fellowship in Zurich, full funding, direct mentorship with global policy leaders, and a platform to finally scale the software I'd built. It was the kind of opportunity that didn't just open doors, it rewrote futures. I kept the news to myself at first, not because I doubted I'd earned it, but because I'd seen what happened every other time I got close to something good. There was always a conveniently timed accident, like the corrupted file that wiped my senior thesis project the night before submission, or the internship paperwork that mysteriously never made it into the mail. At first, I blamed myself, but over time, the pattern stopped looking random, especially when I started catching Zoe near my desk, or logged into my laptop, or offering to help just before things went wrong. I wanted to believe she was simply careless, but belief without evidence is a trap, and I'd spent enough years in hers. I told them about Zurich on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks before the interview. Zoe blinked twice, like the news didn't register. Then she smiled that sweet, harmless smile she wore, like armor. Wow. Zurich, she said, dragging out the word like it was a stretch. That's ambitious. Mom said she was happy for me, though her tone suggested something closer to concern. Dad asked if it was safe for single women to travel alone that far. I just nodded, thanked them, and left the room, because I'd already made my peace with it. I wasn't telling them for their blessing. I was just letting them know I wouldn't be here forever. The morning before my flight to New York, I woke early to go over my checklist, clothes pressed, documents sorted, boarding pass downloaded, suitcase zipped. Everything was in place. Or so I thought. Until I opened my desk drawer and realized my passport was missing. I froze. Not misplaced, not buried under a stack of papers. Gone. I tore through every folder, every bag, every inch of my room. Nothing. Not on the bookshelf, not behind the printer, not even in the safe where I'd kept it last week. It didn't make sense unless you've lived long enough to recognize when a pattern becomes a plan. I ran downstairs. Mom was in the kitchen, pouring cereal, Zoe stood by the sink in her usual pastel hoodie, scrolling through her phone. I asked if anyone had seen my passport. Mom said maybe I'd left it at work. Zoe raised one brow without looking up and said, "You know, maybe this is the universe saying you're rushing into something that isn't yours yet." Her words felt casual, but her smile didn't. It held that same edge I'd seen before every conveniently timed failure in my life. I stared at her for a long second. The tea kettle whistled behind us. Mom told me to check my car. I didn't move. Something inside me settled, not with panic, but clarity. For years I'd been walking this tightrope of pretending not to see what was happening while quietly preparing for the day it would. That day had finally come. I took a breath, forced a smile, and said, "Maybe you're right. Maybe you're..." I waited until midnight, not out of fear, but because it felt like the cleanest time to disappear. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of floorboards adjusting to the cooling night air. Zoe had already posted a story from her bedroom, a Bible verse paired with a filtered selfie that gave no hint she'd stolen my passport less than 12 hours earlier. Mom was in her room, likely journaling her daily blessings. Dad had turned in after watching one of his documentaries about discipline and duty. It would have been a peaceful night if you didn't know the undercurrent. I did. I'd lived in it long enough to breathe through it. I opened my closet and reached for the false bottom I'd built into the storage chest years ago. Inside was a sealed envelope with everything that mattered. My original documents, printed backups, an emergency credit card I never told anyone about, and most importantly, a valid passport I had applied for under the pretense of international tech conferences. I'd filed for it months ago, quietly, predictably, just in case the pattern repeated. That foresight now felt less like paranoia and more like self-respect. I tucked it into the lining of my bag and zipped it shut. At 12:27 a.m., I texted Theo ready. He replied instantly, pulling up in 3. We hadn't spoken in months, not since we drifted apart after graduation. But he had always been the kind of friend who didn't ask for explanations when you sounded serious. He pulled into the alley behind the house in a silver Prius with tinted windows and the hum of someone used to avoiding attention. I slipped out the back, taking the long path through the neighbor's yard to avoid the security light Dad had installed for our safety. Theo looked at me for a long second when I got in the car, then said, "You good?" I nodded. "Not yet, but I will be." We didn't talk much on the drive. I kept watching the streetlights, measuring distance not in miles, but in emotional weight. The closer we got to the airport, the lighter I felt. It was like stepping out of a costume I didn't know I was wearing. The airport at that hour was quiet but functional. I handed over my backup passport, heart steady, eyes forward. The agent scanned it without flinching and waved me through. I didn't look back. The flight to New York was short but gave me space to breathe. I kept my phone off, not ready to play my part in the next family drama. I knew there would be calls, messages, guilt cloaked as concern, questions disguised as prayers. I'd answer none of them, not yet. When I landed, I changed terminals and waited for my connection to Zurich. This was it. This was the point of no return. The moment you realize that escaping isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's a quiet walk through Gate C6 at 5:42 a.m., while the rest of the world sleeps. On the plane to Zurich, I stared at the seat back in front of me and thought about how many versions of myself I'd had to bury to make it this far. The overachiever who hoped good work would be noticed. The daughter who tried to win approval through silence. The sister who forgave just to keep the peace. All of them had died quietly, slowly, one disappointment at a time. What was left now was someone I didn't fully recognize, but deeply trusted. I closed my eyes and let the engine hum wash over me. Not peace, but the beginning of it. Touching down in Zurich felt surreal. Everything was cleaner, calmer, crisper. The air had a texture I couldn't describe, like it didn't carry the weight of unspoken resentment. I collected my bag, moved through customs, and emerged into the arrivals hall, where a woman stood with a small white sign that read, Baldwin. Her name was Elena, early 40s, tall, blunt haircut, and the kind of presence that made you straighten your posture without meaning to. She offered a firm handshake and a smile that didn't try too hard. "You made it," she said. I smiled back. Of course I did. In the car, Elena explained the next steps. I'd be living in a converted villa outside the city with 6 other fellows from around the world. My research on predictive health data had already caught attention from 2 policy labs. Tomorrow I'd be introduced at an opening panel with the heads of the World Health Advisory Board. I listened carefully, nodded when appropriate, and kept my voice measured. But underneath, a different storm was forming. Not panic, not nerves, just a slow, certain shift in gravity. I wasn't just escaping anymore. I was arriving. As we turned onto a narrow stone road flanked by olive trees, I checked my phone for the first time. 22 missed calls, 12 from Mom, 7 from Dad, 3 from Zoe. The last one just said, "Please come home. We can fix this." I stared at the message without emotion. Fix what? Exactly. The lies. The theft. The years of pretending I was less so. She could feel more. I powered the phone off again. This wasn't their story anymore. It was mine. The villa sat on the edge of a quiet hillside, surrounded by green that felt almost curated, like a soft barrier between the world I came from and the one I was stepping into. Inside, the stone floors were cold but clean, and the windows opened out to views that didn't seem real. The other fellows hadn't arrived yet, or maybe they were keeping to themselves, like I was. Either way, I didn't mind. I needed the silence. For the first time in years, it wasn't heavy. It wasn't the kind of silence that came after someone said something cruel at dinner and no one dared respond. It was a different kind of silence, the kind that leaves room for breath. Elena stopped by later that afternoon. She handed me a schedule, a press packet, and a plain folder with my credentials for the program's first week. "You'll be speaking sooner than expected," she said, her tone steady but curious. "We've shared your research proposal internally. The board wants to hear you present it. That doesn't usually happen until month 2. I nodded, not out of confidence, but because I'd already learned that hesitation was a luxury I couldn't afford. She paused at the door. "You don't seem surprised." I looked at her and replied, "I've been underestimated before. I'd rather be ready than shocked." That night, I reheated lentil stew someone had left in the communal kitchen and ate by the window while the sun disappeared behind the hills. I opened my laptop, reviewed my slides, and started rebuilding the story of my work. For years, I tried to convince people that predictive health AI wasn't about replacing doctors or violating privacy. It was about catching what no one was looking for early enough to prevent the suffering we always claimed to care about. But no one at home had ever asked what I did or why it mattered. Here, they were asking, and I was going to be ready. At 9:41 p.m., my phone buzzed. I hadn't turned it back on since arriving, but curiosity had finally won out, as expected. The notifications were waiting like unpaid bills. Voicemails from Mom, long texts from Dad, all of them a blend of concern and correction. But it was Zoe's messages that caught my eye. She'd gone from silence to storytelling in less than a day. One post featured her sitting on the porch, looking tearful, captioned with a quote about forgiveness and family bonds. Another showed her Bible open next to a mug of tea, tagged with phrases like praying for healing and missing my sister. I read every word like someone studying a language they used to speak but no longer trusted. Her image management was so precise, it could have been part of her college thesis, if she'd ever written one. There was one message, though that broke through the polished facade. It was short. "Why are you doing this to us?" I stared at it longer than I should have. The phrasing was familiar. Not "what did we do?" or "I'm sorry for what I did." Just the quiet accusation that I was the one tearing things apart by no longer playing my role. I didn't reply. I didn't delete it either. I left it there as a reminder of the logic I'd spent years untangling from my own self-worth. The next morning, I presented my project at the opening session. The room wasn't massive, but the people inside carried weight. Policy leads, data scientists, a few UN delegates sitting quietly in the back. I stood at the front and laid out my case, not with fire, but with precision. I showed them numbers, patient stories, case studies that proved this tech could bridge the gap between awareness and action. When I finished, the room didn't erupt. It simply nodded. Elena gave a small smile from the side of the room. That was enough. Validation didn't need to shout. Later that day, she pulled me aside. "You'll want to check the news," she said, handing me her tablet. A tech blog in the U.S. had picked up my name through the fellowship's press release. They'd included a short blurb about my background, my move from Portland, my proposal on digital equity in healthcare. It was nothing dramatic, just a paragraph, but someone had already commented. "Isn't that Zoe Baldwin's sister?" Another replied, "Didn't she run away or something? The church group says she's lost." By that evening, the story had spread. A larger site reposted the announcement with a headline that mentioned me by name. A local station back home picked it up and added their own angle. From Portland to the Alps, the Baldwin daughter who disappeared for a dream. I watched from the villa balcony as my name entered conversations I hadn't asked to join. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I owed anyone an explanation. The phone buzzed again. Zoe had posted a video, voice trembling, saying how families sometimes drift and how we should pray for those who lose their way. The comment section wasn't what she expected. Someone had shared a screenshot of the news article. Another referenced our school history. "Didn't your sister win some science award back in the day?" "Why doesn't your family ever mention her by name?" The narrative was slipping out of her hands. Not because I had taken it, but because I had stopped trying to keep it quiet. By the end of that week, things back home were no longer contained. What started as a local feature on a fellowship participant had spiraled into a quiet storm. Not because I said anything, but because people started asking questions that didn't match the image my family had always curated. The more I stayed silent, the louder the truth became. And that silence wasn't out of fear or resentment. It was strategy. Letting things unfold without interference has a power most people underestimate, especially those who are used to controlling every narrative. Elena noticed the shift before I did. She knocked on my door one morning, holding a tablet and a cup of coffee. "Your name's trending," she said, handing them over with the kind of calm that tells you she's seen things unravel before. I opened the tablet and scrolled. A National Women in Tech magazine had featured me in a roundup about rising voices in ethical AI, linking my background to the larger story about access, equity, and underrepresentation. Somehow, the piece had landed in a Reddit thread where people were discussing nepotism, sibling rivalry, and the pressure of performing inside faith-based families. Dozens of comments mentioned my sister. Some wondered if we were still close. Others dug into Zoe's curated online presence and started comparing timelines, tone, and contradictions. That afternoon, she posted another video. This time, she was seated in our parents' backyard, face bare, voice softer. She said families go through hard seasons, that people make mistakes when they feel overshadowed, that she forgave me for leaving so suddenly, even though it hurt. She paused several times as if waiting for tears that didn't come. The comments were less forgiving than she expected. "You forgave her," someone wrote. "Didn't you hide her passport?" Another replied. "Interesting how you never mentioned her until the news picked her up." The thread grew, and so did the discomfort in our once perfect household. According to Theo, who still had contacts in Portland, our church community had started whispering. Some people had begun quietly unfollowing Zoe's pages. A few asked during Bible study why the Baldwin family had never acknowledged Haley's accomplishments until they were unavoidable. Meanwhile, I kept working. The fellowship's second week focused on cross-cultural strategy, and I was paired with a data analyst from Nairobi named Selena. She was sharp, efficient, and quietly observant. One evening, after reviewing our project milestones, she asked if the rumors online were true. I didn't give her details. I just said, "Sometimes the people closest to you aren't rooting against your failure. They're just scared of what your success reveals about their own choices." She nodded and didn't push. That respect meant more to me than 100 apologies. By the third week, I was invited to give a short presentation at a European tech symposium held in Geneva. It wasn't broadcast globally, but it was streamed to a few hundred industry stakeholders. And that was enough. I walked on stage wearing the navy pantsuit I'd packed last minute, held my notes lightly in one hand, and spoke with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from arrogance, but from having to fight for your own voice every step of the way. When I finished, there was no standing ovation, no dramatic applause, just nods from professionals who understood what it meant to be clear, prepared, and undeniable. The next morning, my inbox was flooded with interview requests, collaboration offers, and a formal invitation to speak at a panel hosted by the UN's Innovation and Ethics Division. I forwarded the details to Elena, who replied with a simple, "Get ready." That was the moment it shifted. I wasn't just the girl who had left. I was the woman who had arrived. And my absence from the old narrative wasn't just an escape, it was a statement. Back home, the pressure started closing in. Zoe's sponsors began pulling quiet distance, reframing their partnerships as seasonal. The youth pastor, who had once quoted her testimony from the pulpit, stopped responding to her stories. According to Jamal, who still followed their church group out of curiosity. Our parents were being asked direct questions about why they never celebrated my work before it made headlines. Mom tried to post a long message about how both her daughters were special in their own ways, but someone replied with screenshots from her old posts that told a different story. "Didn't you once say Haley was too ambitious for her own good? Wasn't it you who asked people to pray for her soul because she chose the world over faith?" Comments piled up faster than she could delete them. I didn't respond, not online, not privately. I didn't need to. The one thing my family never planned for Was this what happens when the person they try to silence doesn't fight back, but simply becomes visible? That kind of presence doesn't need confrontation. It just needs truth, shown quietly, without explanation. The kind of truth that doesn't knock on the door, it walks through it. I started noticing the shift, not just in headlines or comment sections, but in tone's small, almost imperceptible changes in how people spoke about me, how they asked questions without assuming the worst. It wasn't that the world suddenly understood my story. It was that I had stopped waiting for their permission to exist in it. At the fellowship, the projects deepened. I was selected to lead a subgroup focused on algorithmic transparency in medical diagnostics. It was complex work with ethical consequences, the kind of responsibility that used to feel miles out of reach when I was sitting at our kitchen table, being told to stop making everything so complicated. Now, that same skill set was seen as leadership. Funny how geography changes the value of your voice. One afternoon after a workshop, I stayed back to clean up stray notebooks and coffee cups while Elena prepared notes for the press team. She glanced at her phone, then looked at me. "Your sister just posted a letter to you." I didn't ask how she knew. People like Elena don't bring up things by accident. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She handed me her phone anyway. The letter wasn't handwritten. It was a caption beneath a filtered black and white photo of our backyard swing set, one of the few images we both appeared in as kids. Zoe's message was long, measured, designed for impact. She wrote about how she missed me, how the family was hurting, how none of this had to be public. She said she forgave me, again, that she hoped I'd forgive her too, but nowhere in the letter did she say what for. It didn't take long for the responses to come in. Some praised her vulnerability. Others called out the omission. One comment struck me more than the rest. "This isn't a letter. It's a press release. If she wanted to talk, she'd send it privately." I handed the phone back to Elena. Let her keep talking. The more she speaks, the clearer it becomes who she's performing for. Elena nodded, then added quietly, "You know, it's harder to play the victim when the person you tried to bury won't stay quiet." That evening, I received an email from the UN Innovation Office. They wanted me to deliver a keynote at the Youth Policy Summit in Berlin. The invitation wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was practical, logistical, written with the tone people use when they assume you belong in the room. I stared at the screen for a long moment, not out of disbelief, but out of quiet acknowledgement that this was what I'd been building toward in silence for years. Not just opportunity, but credibility. The kind that can't be undone by family drama or disappearing passports. That weekend, the Baldwin House in Portland hosted what they called a family testimony dinner, a carefully worded event that featured Zoe sharing a reflection on forgiveness and sibling reconciliation. Multiple friends who still lived in the area sent me screenshots. There was a slideshow, a buffet, a closing prayer. I was mentioned, not by name, but through vague references to estrangement, culture clashes, and unresolved tension. Someone recorded part of it and posted it online. The comments were brutal. "This feels like damage control, not love. She's treating her sister's success like a PR crisis." Instead of responding, I posted a single photo, me, sitting in a cafe in Berlin with my laptop open, my ID badge in view, and a half-written speech on the screen. The caption was simple. Some stories don't need a defense. They need distance. It wasn't viral, but it didn't need to be. People who knew, understood. People who didn't, never would, and I'd stop trying to convert anyone. The day of the summit arrived quietly. I stood backstage, running over my notes, not out of nerves, but out of respect for the moment. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been told they were too much, too cold, too ambitious, too outspoken, too inconvenient. I walked on stage not to prove anything, but to contribute. When I finished, the applause was measured and professional, exactly the way I liked it. No one cried, no one clutched their chest, just dignified recognition that the girl they'd once dismissed had outgrown every version of her they tried to keep her in. I returned to my seat as the moderator thanked me. My phone buzzed once, a text from Zoe. "Why are you doing this to us?" I stared at it a full minute, then deleted it without replying. Some questions don't deserve answers, especially when they come from people still pretending they were the ones left behind. After the summit in Berlin, I returned to Zurich to find a sealed envelope waiting at the villa. Inside was an invitation embossed with the UN seal, confirming I'd been shortlisted for a speaking role at the Global Ethics Forum in Geneva. The folder included travel details, a briefing on the panel format, and a list of co-speakers that read like a who's who of policy, tech, and international law. It should have overwhelmed me. Instead, it landed with a quiet clarity. This wasn't luck. It wasn't timing. It was the long, slow return of value I'd been told I didn't have. That evening, I walked down to the lake near the villa, phone in hand, wondering if I should let them know. Not Zoe, not Mom, not Dad, them. The collective they who had spent so long reminding me how difficult, different, or dangerous my thinking was. I stared at the blank message field for a full minute, then set the phone down. I didn't owe them a notification. My life was no longer a plea for understanding. It was a statement, a quiet one, but undeniable. I left the lake with no pictures, no captions, and no regrets. At the villa, Elena was waiting in the common room, sorting through press inquiries and logistical plans. She didn't look up when she said, "Your name's showing up in the International Educator Forums now." I sat across from her and nodded. "Are you ready for it to get louder?" she asked. "It already has," I said, and we both knew I wasn't just talking about headlines. Back in Portland, the unraveling continued. According to Theo, Zoe had taken a sudden leave from her youth ministry role, citing stress and a need to refocus. The official statement praised her courage and leadership, but inside their community, the tone was changing. Screenshots from my academic record, competition wins, and research credits had circulated widely. People who used to nod along with Mom's pray for Haley's stories were now asking why she'd never spoken of these accomplishments before. Some quietly admitted they didn't even know I had gone into tech. Others said they always felt something was off, but didn't have the full picture. I didn't correct any of them. I didn't clarify, didn't justify, didn't try to shape a narrative. It was strange, in a way. How peaceful it felt not to defend yourself. How power shifted the moment you stopped asking to be seen and started living as if you already were. The more I stayed quiet, the more people started filling in the blanks on their own, not with pity, but with realization. That was the difference, and it made all the difference. Zoe posted again 2 days later, this time a video shot in her childhood bedroom. The walls were still painted soft peach, with framed quotes and filtered lighting. She looked tired, not performative, just worn. She said she was stepping back from social media indefinitely. She said family wasn't always perfect, and that sometimes people make decisions they don't understand until it's too late. Then she said something I didn't expect. I tried to keep a version of the story that made me feel safe, but that version wasn't fair, not to her, not to you, and maybe not even to me. The comments were mixed. Some clung to her usual script, urging her to stay strong, to return soon. Others saw through it. One wrote, "Maybe just let her shine, quietly, fully, without adding yourself to her light." I didn't reply. I didn't watch it twice. I simply acknowledged the shift and went back to preparing my keynote. When the day of the Geneva Forum arrived, I walked past a row of security checkpoints, lobby journalists, and polished diplomatic teams without flinching. I no longer felt the need to wonder if I belonged there. I was too busy doing the work to ask permission for the space it required. My talk focused on ethical data practices in humanitarian crises, drawing from my fieldwork, early case studies, and lived experience. It wasn't personal, but it was intimate, the kind of honesty that lands not with sentiment, but with precision. Afterward, a delegate from South Africa approached me. She said my framework matched what they were building in rural hospitals. Another from Canada asked to collaborate. Elena looked at me and simply said, "Welcome." That word stayed with me long after the forum ended. Not congratulations, not praise, just acknowledgement. The kind that comes when people no longer need to be convinced. Later that night, I stood on the hotel balcony overlooking Geneva's lights and read a message from Jamal. He sent a clip from a small Portland news station. They were covering the broader story now, not just mine, an entire segment on youth suppression inside performance-based families. My photo was shown briefly, but the focus was broader. "This isn't just about a passport," the anchor said. "It's about who gets to speak, who gets to lead, and what happens when silence is no longer survival." I watched it once, then again, then closed my phone and looked at the city below, calm and wide and full of breath. I didn't feel victorious. I felt real, and that was enough. A few days after the Geneva Forum, I received a formal request from the program director. They were producing a documentary-style feature on innovation leaders under 30 and wanted me to be one of the spotlight profiles. It wasn't flashy or dramatic. The production team was small, mostly international students with handheld cameras and quiet confidence. Still, it meant sitting in front of lights, answering questions not just about code and metrics, but about background, values, and the road no one sees. I hesitated for a full minute before saying yes, not because I wasn't ready to be seen, but because I wasn't sure I wanted to explain what it took to get here. We shot the interview in one of the old libraries on campus, a room filled with dark wood and light that softened around the edges. The first few questions were easy background, project goals, influences, but then the interviewer, a quiet woman from Istanbul, asked what it had cost, not in money or time, but in relationships. I paused, not to censor myself, but to choose clarity over performance. I told her about silence, not just the silence of being ignored, but the kind that's enforced by guilt, framed as loyalty, held up as love. I spoke about what it meant to be useful but never celebrated, trusted with responsibility but never invited into legacy. I talked about how, sometimes, success isn't about ambition at all. It's about survival, getting far enough from the noise to hear your own voice clearly for the first time. When the segment aired, it was quiet, no big press release, no viral moment, just a 10-minute feature nestled among others. But within hours, I started receiving emails, not from journalists or executives, but from students, educators, young professionals, strangers who wrote paragraphs about their own experiences with invisible ceilings and controlled narratives. One girl from Toronto wrote that she'd withdrawn her college application 3 times because her family told her she wasn't stable enough to live abroad. Another, from Argentina, said she kept her university acceptance hidden for months, afraid of how her sister would react. They didn't ask for advice. They just wanted to say, "I get it." And in that quiet, global chorus, something in me settled. Back home, the reaction was different. Jamal sent screenshots from local discussion groups and church circles. Some people were defensive, calling the documentary one-sided or disrespectful to family. Others were starting to change their tone. Not everyone, not instantly, but enough to notice. A former Sunday school teacher commented, "Maybe we should have asked more questions instead of assuming she drifted." Another wrote, "If that was my daughter, I'd be proud, regardless of the history." And that word stuck with me, history, not gossip, not scandal, history. A quiet acknowledgement that something had happened, something not entirely fabricated or exaggerated, something real enough to linger. Meanwhile, Zoe had gone quiet. Her Instagram, once filled with scripture quotes and pastel backdrops, was static. No new stories, no recent posts, just a pinned message that said she was taking space to reflect. I didn't cheer. I didn't roll my eyes. I just noticed, because even silence has weight when it comes from someone who once needed every stage. Around that time, I was invited to join a private session with other young leaders in Geneva. No cameras, no microphones, just a closed circle to talk about legacy, pressure, and visibility. I listened more than I spoke. One participant, a woman from Nairobi, said, "They say the spotlight is the prize, but sometimes it's the heat that changes you." I understood exactly what she meant. Some people fear being unseen. I had feared being misseen, misunderstood, misused, misquoted. Now, I didn't need to be feared or praised. I just needed to keep going. As I walked back to the villa that evening, I passed a small bakery and caught my reflection in the glass. Same coat, same posture, same face. But something behind the eyes had shifted. Not anger, not pride, just steadiness. The kind that doesn't need revenge to feel right. The kind that knows freedom isn't loud. It's sustainable. It's what happens when your choices no longer require permission. That night, I didn't check social media. I didn't wonder who was watching. I drafted a grant proposal for a new open-source tool that would bring predictive care to underserved clinics across Eastern Europe. I set my alarm for 6 a.m. and went to sleep without checking my messages. For the first time in years, I didn't need an audience. I needed results. 2 weeks after the Geneva Forum, I received a letter in the mail, not an email, not a forwarded message, a real paper envelope with my name handwritten in neat cursive I hadn't seen since high school. The return address was from Portland. Inside was a folded sheet of stationery that smelled faintly like lavender. It was from my mother. The letter wasn't long, but it was dense, full of soft phrases and elliptical logic. She wrote that she missed me, that things had gotten out of hand, that no one in the family had intended harm. She said she hoped I would consider coming home for Thanksgiving, that my absence was deeply felt, that the house didn't sound the same without my footsteps on the stairs. There was no mention of the passport, no acknowledgement of how I had been framed as unstable or difficult, No apology for years of diminishing who I was in favor of protecting who they wanted Zoe to be. But the closing line stuck with me. We all love you. Haley, we just didn't always understand how to show it. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. Not because I forgave her, and not because I planned to respond, but because there are some wounds you no longer protect, only archive. That same evening, I opened my inbox to find another message from the UN office. I had been nominated for a position on their youth advisory board, focused on global digital equity. It wasn't a spotlight role. It was behind the scenes, research, policy drafts, interagency coordination, the kind of work I was made for, the kind no one ever clapped for. But that changed things quietly and permanently. I accepted the offer before the email cooled. No hesitation, no second guessing, just clarity. Later, while preparing an early briefing on misinformation in healthcare access, I received a notification from a familiar name. Zoe had posted again after a long stretch of silence. This time it was a blog entry, shared across her dwindling platforms. The tone was different. There were no filters, no props, no coded Bible verses to deflect accountability. She described what it felt like to be raised as the favorite, to be protected from consequences, and to realize too late that protection had cost her credibility. She didn't name me. She didn't mention the passport or the sabotage. But she did say this: when someone else's light threatens your own identity, the problem isn't them. It's the narrowness of the space you've been taught to occupy. I read the post twice, not because I wanted to validate it, but because it was the first time she had written something that didn't sound like a performance. Comments were limited, likes hidden. It was as close to quiet as she'd ever allowed herself to be. I didn't reach out. I didn't need to. Growth doesn't require an audience. And forgiveness, when it's real, doesn't always need a response. Around the same time, I was invited to return to New York to speak at a private event hosted by a health tech accelerator. It had been months since I'd set foot on U.S. soil. I hesitated, not because I feared going back, but because I wasn't sure what it would stir. In the end, I agreed, not for them, for me. When I landed at JFK, I didn't text anyone. I moved through the terminal like any other traveler, collected my suitcase, and headed to the car waiting outside. The event was intimate, less formal than Geneva, but equally impactful. I shared updates on the pilot programs we were testing in underserved regions, how predictive algorithms were helping rural clinics triage resources in real time. After the presentation, a woman in her 50s approached me. She didn't introduce herself with a title or affiliation. She just said, "I'm from Portland. My daughter used to follow your sister's videos. She always wondered what happened to you. Until now." I nodded, not with smugness, but with quiet recognition. Visibility has a long echo. You never know who's listening. And sometimes, the people you think forgot you were simply waiting for the full story. That night, I stayed at a small hotel near Central Park. I thought briefly about reaching out to Zoe. Then I didn't, not because I wasn't ready, but because the version of me who needed her to acknowledge the past no longer lived in this skin. I wrote my policy memo, scheduled a call with Elena for the next morning, and closed my laptop without checking social media. Some stories end with reunions. Mine didn't, and it didn't have to. Not every resolution looks like a warm embrace. Sometimes it looks like peace you built yourself, brick by quiet brick. While everyone else was too busy maintaining appearances, that kind of ending is quieter, but far more permanent. By the time I returned to Zurich, something had shifted, not just externally, but internally. The trip back to New York had confirmed what I already suspected. Closure wasn't something anyone could give me. It wasn't in a conversation, or a headline, or even an apology. Closure was what happens when you no longer seek permission to exist where you always belonged. And once that truth settles into your bones, everything else becomes noise. My schedule resumed quickly. Mornings filled with policy briefs, afternoons spent in cross-border collaboration calls, and evenings writing up proposals that felt far removed from anything my former life would have understood. I still carried a copy of my original research, but now it lived more as a reminder of what I had to fight to protect than a resume item I needed to prove. One evening, after a long meeting with our counterparts in Nairobi, Elena sent me a message. It wasn't formal, not even professional, just a quiet note that read, "You've been nominated for the Global Equity Impact Prize. They're calling it the quietest revolution they've seen." I stared at the screen for a full minute, then closed the tab without replying. Not because I didn't care, but because, for the first time, recognition didn't feel like redemption. It felt like reflection. A mirror held up to years of being told I was too sharp, too ambitious, too difficult to be taken seriously. Now those same qualities were being called vision, resilience, and strategy. The prize came with a short feature on international broadcast, a panel appearance at the World Digital Summit in Seoul, and a Q&A streamed live in multiple languages. As I prepared my outline, I found myself drawn to one question I knew would come. What would you say to young people who feel trapped inside families that can't see their worth? I didn't write an answer at first. I let it sit, unfinished, like an old room you're finally ready to clean out. When I did come back to it, the words were simple. Stop asking to be chosen, choose yourself, and then act like you were never optional. The night before the summit, I went for a walk through the old part of the city. The streets were quiet, with snow beginning to layer itself gently along windowsills and rooftops. I passed a bookstore, still lit, even though it had closed. Inside, on a display stand, was a book of essays titled Redefining the Black Sheep. I didn't know the author, but the title made me stop. I stood there for a long time, not out of sentiment, but because for the first time, the label didn't sting. It didn't mean outcast. It meant clarity. It meant survival. It meant someone who chose to leave, not to escape, but to become. At the summit the next day, I sat beside a young diplomat from Argentina, a civic tech leader from Malaysia, and an educator from Ghana. When my turn came, I answered clearly. I didn't tell my story. I told my truth. That legacy isn't always passed down. Sometimes it's rebuilt from nothing. That recognition feels hollow unless it's preceded by being overlooked. That the hardest part of success isn't earning it. It's learning how to carry it without shrinking. I didn't mention my sister. I didn't mention the house or the passport or the sabotage, but I carried them all with me anyway, not as burdens, but as evidence. You don't owe the world your pain, but sometimes letting them see your resilience is enough. After the panel, I received a text from a number I hadn't saved, but immediately recognized. It was short. You looked strong. You are strong. I hope we get to talk one day. No cameras. It didn't say Zoe's name. It didn't have to. I didn't reply. I wasn't angry. I just didn't feel the urgency anymore. Growth had changed the urgency. The girl who once wanted acknowledgement now just wanted time to keep building. And in that stillness, I found something deeper than closure. I found sovereignty. I walked back to my room, set my notes aside, and opened a new document. Not a speech, not a grant, not an outline, just a title, The Architecture of Self. I didn't know if it would become a book, a lecture series, or stay a private reflection, but I knew it needed to begin, because sometimes, when you've been told for years that your voice is too much, the most powerful thing you can do is use it fully, not to correct anyone, not to explain, but simply to speak as if the world was always meant to hear you. Months later, I stood on the steps of the United Nations building in New York, waiting for the final session of the Global Innovation Forum to begin. The sun was low but sharp, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement like reminders of how far we all had come. I wasn't nervous, not because the moment wasn't big, but because I no longer filtered my presence through their gaze. There was no one left to convince, no audience I was performing for, only the work, the people it would reach, and the ones still living quietly in houses like the one I left, wondering if choosing themselves would destroy everything or save them. I knew the answer now. It was both. Inside, the energy buzzed with quiet intention, cameras clicked, translators whispered into earpieces, and delegates passed each other with measured nods. Elena found me in the lobby, handed me my speaking badge, and said nothing more than, "You ready?" I nodded, took the card, and walked toward the hallway lined with names that had once felt unreachable. There was no fanfare when I stepped into the room, no music, no spotlight, just the sound of chairs adjusting and pens clicking as I took my place at the table. The moderator introduced me as a policy strategist working on equitable AI applications for humanitarian systems, not a survivor, not a symbol, just a professional. I spoke about data dignity, about infrastructure gaps, about how algorithms without ethics could replicate the very biases they were designed to fix. I outlined frameworks, cited pilot data, and answered questions with specifics. I didn't mention where I came from, or who had tried to stop me, or what I had to unlearn just to be taken seriously. I didn't need to. The work spoke louder than any origin story ever could. When the session ended, a young woman approached me in the hallway. She looked barely 20, a little underdressed, her press badge hanging from a borrowed lanyard. She said she was a student from a state school in Kentucky, interning with a media outlet that couldn't afford to send their full team. She said she'd watched my panel and read about the fellowship. Then she asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, "How did you know when it was time to leave?" I didn't ask what she meant. I just told her the truth. When staying started feeling like disappearing, she nodded like she'd been holding her breath for months. Later that night, I returned to my hotel room and opened a new message from Zoe. This time it wasn't about guilt or distance. It simply said, "I saw the speech. I'm stepping back from the platform entirely, not out of shame, just out of clarity. I think I'm finally starting to hear my own voice." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Growth isn't always a conversation. Sometimes it's just the absence of noise. Before I turned in, I checked the live feed. The forum replay had already gone up, with a comment thread filled with questions, quotes, and invitations. But one message stood out. It was from a teenager named Alina in Jakarta. She wrote, "My sister told me I was selfish for applying to study abroad, but you reminded me that self-worth isn't rebellion, it's survival. I printed your quote and taped it to my mirror. Thank you." I read it twice, not because I needed the validation, but because I wanted to remember what this was really about. Not revenge, not exposure, not even redemption, just proof that rising is possible, that leaving can be sacred, that some of us don't break cycles by confronting them, but by stepping around them and building something entirely new. That legacy isn't inherited, it's designed, moment by moment, choice by choice, until one day you look up and realize the space you once begged to enter no longer fits. The next morning, as I packed for the flight back to Zurich, I placed a small note inside my carry-on. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It simply read, "Some doors are meant to be locked behind you. Others, you leave open, just wide enough for the next person to find their way through." And maybe that's what this story was really about all along. Not about proving anyone wrong, just about proving I was always right to believe I didn't have to stay small. Now let me ask you something. If you stopped shrinking for everyone else's comfort, how big could your life actually become?